Every Wednesday, I lead chapel for the students in our church's preschool. And I did the same thing when I was in San Diego. And one day, while I was leading chapel there, one of the boys raised his hands and said, "I'm God." Now, we had a lot of families from different worldviews and spiritual perspectives, and I could tell that this boy was being sincere. I'm God, you're God, we're all God. And not knowing his parents' belief and wanting to respect them, I simply said, well, the Bible teaches us that God who made us can live inside us. Once again, the boy said, "I'm God." At this point, the little girl sitting next to him turned and looked right at him and said, "You're not God." Today, we're starting a new series on prayer. And as we do, I want to suggest that this interaction between these two preschoolers gets us to the heart of the matter. At its most foundational level, prayer forces us to ask, who is God and who am I? Prayer is universal. Muslims pray, Jews pray, Hindus pray, Buddhists pray, even atheists pray. I think we've all heard the expression, there are no atheists in foxholes. Think about all the folks in AA groups that pray to any and every higher power. According to Gallup polls, 90% of Americans pray regularly. Wow. We human beings can't help but pray. And we pastors love to tell stories about prayer giants. Martin Luther prayed 2 to 3 hours every day. Charles Spurgeon, Charles Finney, David Brennard all spent 3 hours a day praying. Charles Simeon prayed for 4 hours a day. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, woke up at 4 a.m. every day to pray for 4 hours. There are some great prayers in history. And then there are the rest of us. If you ask folks about their prayer life, the conversation often goes something like this. Is prayer important to you? Yeah. Do you pray regularly? Yeah, I'd say so. How long do you pray for? I don't know, maybe 5 minutes. Do you find your prayer times to be satisfying? Not really. Do you when you pray, do you sense God's presence? Not very often. In theory, prayer is important to us. In practice, prayer can be frustrating or even disappointing. One company conducted a website poll, and of the 678 people who responded to this poll, only 23 were satisfied with the time they were spending in prayer. 23 out of 678. We can't help but pray, yet we struggle to pray. Why? Well, I think the Bible helps us answer that question, particularly the very first prayer in the Bible. If prayer is communicating with God, the first recorded prayer, the first words ever spoken to God are these words from Adam. I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. I believe that this prayer and the story surrounding it help us understand both our need for prayer and our struggle with prayer. Genesis 2 describes how God forms Adam from the dust of the ground and then breathes the breath of life into him. And the name Adam comes from the Hebrew word for dust or ground. So Adam is a dust creature breathed to life by God. Genesis 2 also describes how God makes Eve out of Adam's rib and then brings her to him. And as we just heard, Genesis 2 ends with these words, the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Children are like that early on, right? I think any parent knows that for sure. You know, Micah and Daniel are a little older now, but when they were younger, they used to love taking off their clothes and running around naked. without any shame or embarrassment, right? Yeah, naked dance, you know? Adam and Eve were totally naked all the time, and they didn't care. But then the serpent shows up, and the serpent says, "Did that stingy God really say that you can't eat from any tree in the garden?" Eve replies, he said we can't eat from the tree that's in the middle of the garden. We can't even touch it or we'll die. Actually, not exactly what God said. "You won't die," says the serpent. "God knows that if you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God." So Adam and Eve eat the fruit. And as soon as they do, their eyes are open and they realize that they are naked. So they sew fig leaves together to cover themselves. As soon as they eat the fruit, they look down and yell, "Ah, I'm naked!" Eating the fruit makes them ashamed to be naked. Why? Because in eating the fruit, they are trying to be like God, and their nakedness reminds them that they're not. Imagine a toddler were to walk up to his parents and say, "This is my house. I'm in charge now." And then look down and see his diaper. "Ah, I'm wearing Pampers." His diaper would be a reminder that he's pretending to be someone he's not. Adam and Eve's nakedness is a reminder that they're pretending to be someone they're not. They are dust creatures trying to be God. Now, as I've said before, we are Adam and Eve. Their story is our story. We are dust creatures. That's why we can't help but pray. But we're dust creatures trying to be God. That's why we struggle to pray. That's why we have such a hot and cold relationship with prayer. We long to pray, yet we hide from it. We're attracted to it, and yet repelled by it. We see it as something we should do, even want to do, and yet we struggle to actually do it. And we're not sure why. What really holds us back from praying? Oh, we say we're busy. Too many demands on our time. But we all know that we make time for the things we want to do. Even on my busiest day, I can find 30 minutes to watch a little football. No, there's something else going on. Something deeper. And that deeper thing is that we are created to live life with God, but there's something in us that turns and hides from God. This is what we see in Genesis. After Adam and Eve sew the fig leaves to cover themselves, we find these words. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. That's kind of an odd line, right? As John Ortberg points out, God is spirit. God doesn't have a body. God doesn't have legs or feet. What does it sound like when God goes for a walk? The point of this phrase, I believe, is that walking is something you do with somebody you care about. Friend with a friend, a parent with a child. I still remember that, walking to school with my two sons. Two people in love would go for a walk. It's not about the walk, it's about being with that person. You know, one of my favorite places in the world is Lake Chelan, Washington. And I have just a few, anyone ever been to Lake Chelan, Washington? Okay, so I have a few slides. This is Lake Chelan, Washington, middle of Washington State. That's the lake. It's 50 miles long. It's got these mountains on both sides. We got another shot here. These are just a few shots. That's us on Lake Chelan riding behind a boat. And then we got this one more shot. So Lake Chelan is where Granny lived. And this is Granny's house. And it still looks this way. It hasn't changed since the 1950s. This house still has a phone with, this kind of thing, like this. It still does. It really does. So I moved around a lot growing up, but my family would always return to Granny's for holidays and summer vacation. Granny, my dad's mom, lived to 107. And she lived on her own in Lake Chelan well into her late 90s. And every afternoon, after the sun was set over the mountains that surround the lake, Granny would go for a walk in the hills above her house. And I loved going on those walks with Granny. To hear the stories of someone who was born in 1892, to take in the beauty of Chelan, but most of all, just to be with Granny. Walking with Granny at Lake Chelan in the late afternoon was such a privilege. Walking with God in the garden in the cool of the day, what an even greater privilege. What a gift. Genesis is telling us that God, the God of the Bible, is a God who wants to be with us. You and I were made to walk with God. You and I were made for what Dallas Willard calls the with God life. Life with God. The with God life. That's one way to summarize what the entire Bible is about. In Genesis 5, we meet a man named Enoch, and we don't know much about him, but we're told that Enoch walked with God. Later on in Genesis, we're told that Noah walked with God. The story that follows is the story of God being with his people. God is with Abraham. God is with Joseph, even in slavery and prison. God is with Moses. God is with Ruth. And when Jesus Christ is born, we're told, and you shall call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. You and I are made to live life with God. You and I are made for the with God life. That means that you and I are made to pray. We're made for prayer is nothing more than being with God. Prayer is simply keeping company with God. Prayer is walking with God. That's what we're made for. And yet, what happens when Adam and Eve hear the sound of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day? They hide from God among the trees of the garden. To me, that's one of the most tragic verses in the Bible. Here is Adam and Eve's creator, their source of life, the one they are made for. And they run and hide from him. Because of sin, they hide from God when they could be walking with God. And so do you and I. As John Ortberg points out, God makes the garden and puts the trees in it so that there's a place where he can be with the man and the woman, and yet they hide in the trees that God has made. They use the gifts of God to hide from the presence of God. And we still do that. I know at least I do. I first thought about doing this series on prayer when I was in San Diego. I knew I was going to be coming here to KUMC, and I was thinking about talking to people, praying about what to preach on. And I kept coming back to prayer. But part of me did not want to do a series on prayer because I figured I would scare folks away or put you to sleep. See, in my experience, prayer is not a very popular topic. Preach on the 7 deadly sins, and folks think, that sounds interesting. Tell me more about greed, sloth, and gluttony. Preach on, dating, marriage, and sex, and folks say, you've got my attention. But preach on prayer. At my previous church, we did a retreat every year, all-church retreat every spring. And one year, our attendance was lower than any other year. And as we kind of sorted through why that was true, we realized one of the main reasons attendance was lower was because our theme was prayer. That is kind of interesting that the theme of prayer in a church would scare people away. But for some folks, the thought of spending a weekend devoted to prayer, very intimidating. Some of us would rather get a root canal than attend a prayer meeting. I'm right? Some of us break out into cold sweat when someone asks, who'd like to pray? My sense is that the topic of prayer makes many of us uncomfortable or insecure. And I think that's because we feel this need to have everything just right in order to pray. Our lives need to be just right. Our motivations need to be right. Our concerns, our requests need to be right. Our words need to be right. One day when our son Micah was almost 5 years old, we asked him if he wanted to pray, and he said no. And then he said, I'm not good at praying. And that really made me sad to hear a 4-year-old say, I'm not good at praying. Isn't that what we do to prayer? Somehow we make it into this thing that we're good at or we're bad at. Yet prayer is about being with God. It's about keeping company with God, deepening our relationship with God. If I were to say to Micah, let's hang out, I can't imagine him saying, I'm not good at spending time with you, Dad. Relating to me isn't something he needs to be good at. Prayer is about relating to God. It's about the with God life, about an enduring and growing relationship with the maker of the universe. Prior to becoming a pastor, I did campus ministry. And many years ago, a student from UCLA attended a weekend retreat that was designed for spiritual skeptics and seekers. And at that retreat, she made a decision to become a Christian. And in sharing her reason for making this decision, she said, I want to live life with God. I want to live life with God. That is the cry of my heart and the cry of hearts throughout the world. Even more so, that is the cry of God's heart. God wants us to experience life with Him. And so God invites us to pray. Richard Foster expresses this invitation beautifully. He writes, for too long we have been in a far country, a country of noise and hurry and crowds, a country of climb and push and shove, a country of frustration and fear and intimidation. And God welcomes us home. Home to peace and joy. Home to friendship and fellowship. Home to intimacy and affirmation. The key to this home, this heart of God, is prayer. Perhaps you have never prayed before except in anguish or terror. Never mind. I am here to tell you that the Father's heart is open wide. You are welcome to come in. Perhaps you don't believe in prayer. Maybe you've tried to pray in the past and were disappointed or disillusioned. Maybe you have little faith or none. It does not matter. The Father's heart is wide open. You are welcome to come in. Perhaps you are bruised and broken by the pressures of life. Others have wronged you. You have old, painful memories that have never been healed. You avoid prayer because you feel too distant, too unworthy. Do not despair. The Father's heart is open wide. You are welcome to come in. Perhaps you've prayed for many years, but the words have grown brittle and old. Little ever happens anymore. God seems remote and inaccessible. Listen to me. The Father's heart is open wide. You are welcome to come in. Perhaps prayer is the delight of your life and you can attest to God's goodness, but you long for more power, more love, more of God's presence. Believe me, the Father's heart is open wide. You are welcome to come higher up and deeper in. The Father's heart is open wide. You are welcome to come in. This morning, God is inviting you to pray. And that's what we want to do in this series. Pray. Not listen to me talk about prayer, but pray. This series is called Prayer, Discovering the Difference It Makes. And the only way to discover the difference prayer makes is to pray. To try it and see. It's the only way. To learn how to swim, you've got to jump in the pool. There's absolutely no other way. So as we start this series, I want to invite you to join us in a church-wide experiment. To commit to experiencing prayer in one new way for the next 5 weeks. Whatever that looks like is up to you. Maybe it means for the next 5 weeks, I'll read one psalm each night before I go to bed. I'll spend 5 minutes sitting quietly in my office at the beginning of the workday. I'll go through our church directory and pray for one person or family each day. I'll walk around my neighborhood once a week and pray for my neighbors. I'll find a prayer partner and pray with him or her once a week. I'll pray with my spouse once a week. As soon as I wake up in the morning, I'll just say, "Good morning, God. I want to be with you today." I'll try and experiment to see if God exists. I will simply pray, "God, if you're real, reveal yourself to me." These are just examples. Pick one way that works for you. Pick one way that appeals to you. Choose one new way you will experience prayer in the next 5 weeks. We're going to do that together. And when we're done, we're going to ask the question, has praying made any difference? Let's find out. Amen.